I stepped carefully along the corridor, boots clanging against the metal floor in a rhythm that seemed almost comical against the station's eerie silence. The hum of the dying engines filled the air with a low, almost apologetic groan, like the station itself knew it wasn't in its prime anymore. My scanner beeped occasionally, detecting the usual anomalies: floating screws, drifting cables, and the occasional spark of static from the failing power grids. Nothing hostile, just the slow decomposition of a place that once buzzed with life and commerce. And then I saw her. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor in a corner that was half shadow, half illuminated by the failing emergency lights. Her long ears, pointed and graceful, twitched slightly at the sound of my footsteps, catching even the faintest vibrations of the station's trembling hull. I froze for a moment, wondering if I'd stumbled into a dream or a very bad virtual reality simulation. Her skin had an odd, faintly phosphorescent glow, as if she absorbed the station's meager light and gave it back in muted pulses. She looked human at first glance, but the details betrayed her alien nature. The ears, yes, but also the subtle lines on her neck that shifted like living circuitry, and her eyes, which held the shimmer of a starlit nebula trapped behind thin glass. I swallowed nervously and forced a grin, trying to break the tension with something human and recognizable. "Hey," I said. "You know, sitting on the floor here isn't exactly ergonomically ideal. Space-age furniture might be over there if you're into that kind of thing." She didn't respond immediately. She just tilted her head, ears flicking like a cat's tail at the slightest movement, and stared at me. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between suspicion and boredom, like she'd seen everything the universe had to offer and found it mostly disappointing. I crouched slowly, trying to make my presence less threatening, and realized how absurd it must have looked. A human man, knees bent awkwardly, talking to a cross-legged alien vampire who could probably crush my ribcage if she wanted to. Humor, I decided, might be my only weapon. "So," I continued, "do you come here often? Because I swear I've never seen anyone hang out in a dead station before. You must have some sort of membership card or a really good loyalty discount." She didn't laugh, but I saw a faint twitch in her mouth that I chose to interpret as amusement. I edged a little closer, glancing at the surrounding mess. Sparks flew from broken circuits, tools floated lazily in the low gravity, and a few panels dangled from the walls like oversized ornaments. The air smelled faintly of burnt plastic and old machinery. "You know," I added, "I usually charge admission for this kind of horror show, but I guess for you I'll make an exception." She blinked slowly, and for a moment I wondered if blinking in that slow, deliberate way was her alien equivalent of a sarcastic clap. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and melodic, but it carried an undercurrent that made me jump slightly. "Human," she said, "you survived this station?" I chuckled nervously. "Well, it's not exactly a five-star resort, but I manage, and apparently you do too, so maybe we're both experts in low-budget survival techniques." She made a noise that I guessed was a laugh. Not the kind of laugh that shakes your ribcage, more like the hiss of a distant comet brushing a planet's atmosphere. I sat down carefully, keeping my hands visible and my distance respectful, and tried to keep the conversation going. "So you're a vampire, huh? No offense, but when I imagine vampires, it's usually all capes and gothic castles. You're sitting on the floor like you forgot your home address." She tilted her head, ears twitching, and I thought I saw the faintest ghost of a smile. "Home," she said, "is relative, and capes are cumbersome in zero gravity." I laughed out loud, and she made that same curious noise, which I took as approval. Hours, or maybe minutes, because time had no respect for us in this part of the station, passed in small, awkward bursts of conversation. I learned her name, though it sounded strange in my tongue, like a melody I couldn't quite hum. I discovered that she subsisted on synthetic plasma packs instead of blood, which she claimed made her less dramatic at dinner parties. I told her humans usually subsisted on caffeine and regret, and she tilted her head, seemingly considering which diet sounded worse. Every so often I would gesture toward a floating tool or spark, and she would comment on it, explaining some bizarre alien principle I didn't quite understand. Magnetic flux fields, gravitational distortions, and something about energy resonance that I pretended to comprehend, nodding sagely while secretly hoping I didn't blow myself up by touching the wrong panel. Occasionally, she made jokes in her own language, a series of clicks and hums that sounded like a malfunctioning synth. I laughed anyway, and she made a noise that was close enough to laughter for me to feel included. At some point, I tried to reach out to bridge the final gap of space and distrust, and she recoiled slightly, but not violently, just enough to remind me that alien vampires had personal space policies stricter than airport security. "I don't bite," I said quickly, waving my hands. "Unless you count sarcasm." She tilted her head and made a sound that could have been amusement or a warning, I wasn't sure which. Either way, it was progress. By the time the emergency lights flickered one last time before surrendering to darkness, we were sitting in a kind of understanding silence. No words, just presence. Floating tools spun lazily around us like tiny satellites, sparks from broken circuits lit our faces intermittently, and the station's dying hum became a kind of lullaby. I realized then that the absurdity of the situation, an alien vampire with long ears and a human who told bad jokes, was exactly what made the station feel less like a tomb. It was, improbably, a first step toward something neither of us could have expected, a fragile, hesitant connection in a universe that didn't hand out easy friendships. And somewhere, in the corner of that abandoned station, I swore I heard the faintest echo of a laugh. I woke to the station's artificial gravity whining as if it had pulled an all-nighter, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then I saw her, still sitting cross-legged on the floor, long ears twitching as she scanned the flickering readouts of a terminal I didn't even know still worked. Her eyes caught mine, glinting with something that was not hostility, not hunger, something more like curiosity mixed with mild irritation, the universal expression of someone who'd just been woken from a nap by a human who couldn't figure out how to operate a coffee replicator. I waved, trying to look casual, but gravity had other plans and I nearly toppled over. She made that curious noise again, the one I'd convinced myself was her version of a laugh, and I smiled sheepishly. "First lesson of the day," I said. "Do not underestimate the effect of semi-functional gravity on the human coordination system." She tilted her head, ears flicking in that hypnotic, impossible way, and for a moment I was convinced she understood every word. We moved cautiously through the station's derelict halls, her gliding almost silent, her long fingers brushing against floating panels as though testing them for some hidden property. I followed, clumsily bumping into loose wires and a floating wrench that had somehow acquired orbit, and I joked, "I swear these tools have formed a union against me." She hummed, a sound that was clearly her version of amusement, and flicked a hand. The wrench obeyed, slowly spinning back to a shelf that may or may not have been bolted to anything solid. "Discipline," she said. "Even in chaos, control is necessary." I nodded sagely, though I had no idea what that meant, and muttered, "I'll add that to my resume, expert in chaos diplomacy." She stopped at a panel, her long ears twitching as she scanned it, and I peered over her shoulder. The readouts showed fluctuations in energy I couldn't begin to understand. "That's really impressive," I said, hoping to sound knowledgeable. "You can track, whatever that is?" She gave me a look, one that clearly said, "Yes, human, I can track it. You can track your own breakfast if you try hard enough." I grinned, point taken. "I'll stick to the things I know, like sarcasm and accidentally triggering alarms." She made that low, melodic sound again, and I imagined she was either laughing or issuing a warning. Either way, it encouraged me. We explored the station slowly, each step punctuated by the occasional quip from me, often met with that peculiar hum from her. "So," I said, as we floated past a drifting crate of synthetic plasma packs, "do you ever get tired of plasma?" "Humans get tired of coffee sometimes, but at least coffee doesn't glow in the dark." She glanced at me, ears twitching, and responded, "It sustains, it is boringly reliable, unlike humans who thrive on mistakes." I laughed at that. "Hey, mistakes are part of the charm, we wouldn't be humans without them. Imagine a universe full of perfectly competent beings, talk about dull dinner conversations." She tilted her head, and for a moment I could swear her expression was amused. "You speak as though charm matters when survival is in question," she said. I shrugged. "Maybe not, but it keeps the boredom at bay." At one point, I reached out to touch a floating console that had been oscillating wildly, and she flicked her hand, sending a tiny magnetic pulse that nudged it gently into place. Careful, she said, or you will create a cascade failure. I raised my hands defensively. I like to live on the edge, it's the human thing to do, edge living, chaos management, I practically invented it. She hummed again, ears twitching, and I took it as the closest thing to a compliment I'd received from an alien vampire. We settled near a bulkhead that had a partially functioning observation window, through which the distant stars glittered coldly. I floated there, hands behind my head, staring at the void. You know, I said, humans have a saying, space is lonely. I guess you'd find that redundant, living in it constantly. She didn't reply immediately. Then she leaned back, ears brushing the wall, and said softly, loneliness is an interesting concept. I am often accompanied by silence. Silence does not always listen. I tried to match her somber tone and failed spectacularly, so I added, silence doesn't clap either. So I guess that makes me better company? She hummed, and this time I was fairly certain it was amusement. Time drifted, or maybe I drifted through time, but the station's decay didn't seem to matter. We communicated in a strange mix of language, gesture, and telepathy she occasionally allowed me to glimpse. I made jokes, sometimes intentionally bad, about how she could be the most terrifying creature in the galaxy, yet here she was, floating around like an overgrown cat with a caffeine addiction. She sometimes clicked or hummed in response, and I convinced myself those were laugh equivalents. It was absurd, it was ridiculous, and yet, somehow, it was comforting. She guided me to a control room that still had partial functionality. She manipulated the interface with elongated fingers, long ears twitching as she interpreted complex energy readings, and I tried to keep up, offering commentary like a sports announcer narrating a very niche game. And she's adjusting the flux capacitor. Oh wait, wrong sci-fi universe. Nevertheless, watch as the alien vampire demonstrates the ancient art of energy management while keeping her sarcasm levels under galactic control. She made that hum again, the one I took for laughter, though I suspected it might have been a mix of amusement and exasperation. At one point, a section of the hull shuddered violently, and I grabbed for a rail, flailing spectacularly. I meant to do that, I shouted, trying to look intentional, but she only stared at me, ears erect, with what I interpreted as a dry, alien version of judgment. You are fragile, she said, but persistent. I grinned. I like to think of it as charming. Persistence is underrated in human culture. She hummed softly, and I pretended it was applause. As the artificial day, or whatever semblance of day the station had worn on, I realized we had settled into an odd routine. I made jokes to keep the tension light, she hums or clicks in response, and we explored the station's strange and failing systems together. It wasn't friendship, not yet, and it wasn't trust, not fully, but it was something neither of us expected. Companionship in the emptiness. A human and an alien vampire, both oddly fragile, both surviving in a station that had no right to hold life, and yet somehow in our absurdity we were keeping each other alive. By the time the failing lights dimmed and the station's hum softened into an almost gentle whisper, we were sitting side by side, observing floating debris, occasional sparks, and distant stars. I floated there, realizing the absurdity of my own survival, while she adjusted a console with the precision of a creature who had seen galaxies form and die. And in that quiet chaos, amid floating plasma packs and drifting tools, I understood that humor, curiosity, and a little bit of courage could build a bridge even between the most unlikely beings. The fragile trust was forming, one awkward joke, one magnetic nudge, and one strange hum at a time. I drifted through the station's corridors, hands brushing against walls that buzzed softly, half alive with failing circuits, and I realized I had begun to understand it, not in a technical sense, not like an engineer decoding a machine, but in a way that mattered more. The station, like her, was complicated, vulnerable, and unpredictable. I could joke about floating tools forming a union, and she would hum in response, ears twitching with that odd elegance that had grown almost comforting. Somehow, amid this chaos of metal and failing energy grids, we had carved out a small orbit of normalcy. She was waiting near the central hub, sitting cross-legged as usual, but this time she looked different, not physically, that would have been impossible, but as if the quiet tension between us had finally settled into a rhythm. Her long ears twitched gently, and I swore I could detect the faint pulse of her bioluminescence syncing with the station's heartbeat. "Human," she said, voice soft, carrying an almost mischievous undertone. "You persist. I grinned. I like to think of it as stubbornness with style. Charm is secondary. She tilted her head, and I thought I caught a hint of amusement in the way her eyes shimmered. We had spent what could have been days or maybe hours. Time was strange here, testing the station's failing systems, laughing at each minor disaster, and somehow surviving. I had learned that humor was not just human. She could appreciate it too, in her own alien way, between clicks, hums, and soft vibrations that I had convinced myself were her version of laughter. And through that, I had begun to see her not as a monster, not as a predator lurking for some inevitable meal, but as a being capable of connection, curiosity, and, remarkably, patience. I floated closer, glancing at the drifting debris, the sporadic sparks, the dangling tools that had long since given up trying to obey gravity. "You know," I said, trying to sound casual, "this station may be falling apart, but I think we make it look like a functioning galactic resort. Minimal decor, occasional plasma leaks, and just enough danger to keep life interesting." She tilted her head, ears flicking, and that soft hum returned. "You find amusement in chaos," she observed. "Humans unpredictable." I chuckled. "Predictability is boring. I mean, if we were predictable, would we even be here, staring at the stars from a space station falling apart around us?" She didn't reply immediately, just watched me with those nebula-like eyes. Then, in the quiet that had become familiar between us, she extended a hand, fingers elongated, delicate, almost fragile against the faint currents of the station's magnetic fields. I hesitated, heart thudding in a rhythm entirely human, entirely absurd. I promise I won't bite," I said, humor slipping nervously into my tone, "unless you count sarcasm. But I can't promise to stop making terrible jokes." Her eyes studied me for what felt like an eternity. The hum that escaped her throat was soft, uncertain, like a key testing a lock, and then she touched my hand. Just a light contact, enough to send a shiver through the magnetic current that ran between us, enough to dissolve the last of the fear I hadn't realized I was holding. "Trust," she said simply. One word, alien, human adjacent, weightless in the void around us. And in that moment, the station felt less like a tomb and more like a home we had built from laughter, curiosity, and shared survival. We moved together then, cautiously at first, to the observation deck. The window was cracked in one corner, but stars poured in like glitter scattered across black velvet. I drifted there, floating, and she joined me, her long ears brushing against the edges of the frame, eyes tracing constellations I didn't recognize. But she explained anyway, in clicks and hums that slowly became words I could understand. She spoke of systems far beyond the station, galaxies I had only ever seen in faded charts, planets with seas of liquid crystal, skies that burned with energy storms, and beings whose lives were so vast I felt both tiny and privileged to witness a fraction of it. I listened, occasionally adding commentary, often jokes, and she responded, sometimes correcting me, sometimes laughing or humoring me. And for the first time, the loneliness of space didn't feel like mine alone. Later, I realized that I had changed. I had arrived expecting danger, perhaps a confrontation, or at least some dramatic survival scenario. Instead, I had found companionship, the absurdity of life amplified by the emptiness around us, and a perspective that stretched farther than I had ever dared to imagine. Humor, I learned, was not trivial, it was a bridge. Courage wasn't just in surviving plasma leaks or low-gravity slips, it was in reaching out, in trusting the unknown, in floating hand in hand with an alien vampire whose existence defied every human preconception. The station creaked and moaned around us, but for the first time that sound wasn't threatening. It was music, accompaniment to a strange duet we had composed. Human resilience paired with alien patience, sarcasm paired with subtle telepathy, fear paired with cautious trust. I floated near her, letting my hand brush hers once more, and I knew that whatever awaited us beyond this station, rescue, repair drones, or the slow disintegration into cosmic dust, we had each other. "Ready to see if the escape pods still work?" I asked, trying to keep the mood light. She tilted her head, ears flicking, and that soft hum returned, carrying something almost like amusement. "Yes," she said. "But only if you promise no more jokes about plasma packs." I laughed. "I'll try, but no guarantees. Habit dies hard." As we navigated toward the pods, floating past the half-functioning control panels and the odd spark of electricity that threatened minor disasters at every turn, I felt a strange serenity settle over me. The station had not been tamed, the systems had not been restored, and the universe beyond was as vast and indifferent as ever. But in the tiny orbit we had formed, in laughter and trust and the absurdity of our existence together, I had found something larger than survival. I had found connection, and in that connection, a courage I didn't know I possessed. When we finally pushed off into one of the pods, the station shrinking behind us like an exhausted old friend, I glanced at her. Her long ears were relaxed now, no longer flicking with caution, her eyes softer, almost like starlight contained in flesh. "Human," she said quietly, "you endure." I grinned. Endure and make jokes. Sometimes in that order, sometimes simultaneously. She made that hum one last time, and I decided